My favorite murder. Da, 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 da. Okay, I have to refilm the bit about what my favorite murder is and what May's favorite murder is because I had lipstick on my teeth in the first one, which is horribly embarrassing. So here we are again. May's favorite murder is a concept that I created last year, where in the month of May I read exclusively books that are recommended on the podcast My Favorite Murder. If you don't know what My Favorite Murder is, it's a podcast hosted by Karen Kilgariff and Georgia Hardstark, and it's a true crime comedy podcast, and they're just the most wonderful ladies, the most wonderful comedians, and just it has a special place in my heart. And they recommend a lot of books on their show, and so I started keeping a list on Goodreads. I have a bookshelf called My Favorite Murder Book. I started keeping track of all of the books that they recommend so that I can read them in my own time, and I decided that May was going to be the month in which I do that. So without further ado, let's get into them. Don't have a lot of them in physical copies. I wanted to wait to make this video until I got some books in the mail that I'm waiting on, but it just, with the schedule, wasn't gonna work out, so I decided I'll just film it without the books, and you'll just have to deal with hearing my boring voice. The first book that I'm planning on reading this month, and I actually just started today, is Daring Greatly by Brené Brown. Brené Brown narrates the audiobook, so it's told in her voice, in her writing style, and so far I'm really enjoying it. It's not a true crime book, obviously, but it is a book that they recommend and talk about all the time on the podcast, and I've never read it, so it's just about, it's a kind of a self-help book about being vulnerable and being your greatest self, etc., etc. The next book I'm planning on reading is Chase Darkness With Me by Billy Jensen. Billy Jensen is, of course, the host of another podcast on My Favorite Murders podcast network called Exactly Right. He is the host of The Murder Squad along with Paul Holes. Love Paul Holes. And this is his book that just came out last year. It's just about his time as a crime journalist and how he got into like solving unsolved cases, even though he's not a cop or a detective, he's just a journalist. And he's just an amazing guy, so I'm really excited to read it. I'm reading this one on ebook. The next book I'm planning on reading this month is Mindhunter by John Douglas and Mark Olschiker. This book is what was the basis for the Netflix series, if you've seen the Netflix series Mindhunter. It is all about John Douglas. It's all about his time creating the FBI's serial crime unit and how they developed their methods for the behavioral science behind serial killing, etc., etc. I've owned this book for about a year now, and I haven't gotten to it yet. I was trying to get to it last May for that year's May Favorite Murder, but I got into a really bad reading slump last May and just didn't end up finishing anything. I finished a couple books for that month, but I didn't get to this one. Another book that I plan to read this month I am very, very excited about, and that is The Last Book on the Left, which is a different podcast's book, The Last Podcast on the Left, with Marcus Parks, Henry Zabrowski, and Ben Kissel, and they are friends of My Favorite Murder. They've guest starred on some of their shows before. The My Favorite Murder girls have been on their show before, and they just released this book last month that is about their favorite serial killers and crimes. This has been like 3 years in the making, so I'm very excited that it's finally out and that I have it in my hands. The next book that I plan to read is another book that is not a true crime book, because despite my love for all things true crime and my love for true crime books, it is my favorite genre, but it's a lot. Sometimes it's a lot to read in a month if you're reading like 10 books just about murder. So I like to split it up with a couple other regular books that they recommend in the show. And so my next book that I'm planning on reading this month is Let the Great World Spin by Colin McCann. This book is about a man that walks a tightrope across New York City. I believe that's what it's about. I could be wrong. On an episode of a podcast, they have a listener ask the question, if you could only read one book for the rest of your life, what would it be? And this was Georgia Hardstark's pick. Karen Kilgariff's pick was originally National Treasure, but then she changed it to Middlesex, which I've already read, of course. It's my favorite book ever. So I'm really looking forward to reading this one. And I've had this on my shelf for quite a while as well. My ex-boyfriend's dad gave it to me. The other book I'm planning on picking up this month is My Friend Dahmer by Durf Backderf. It's a graphic novel about Jeffrey Dahmer and his life. Durf Backderf went to high school with him and was kind of a little bit friends with him, and so it's just about who he was as a teenager. And I've actually read it before. My dad checked it out from the library when I was like 13 or 14, pretty young, and I remember looking through it and being like, what the fuck? So I have read it before, but I'm excited to have my own copy, and I'm excited to reread it, and hopefully have a better understanding of it than I did when I was 12 or 13. The final book on my official TBR is The Girl on the Velvet Swing by Simon Batts. I got it on Book Outlet, so I got it for super cheap. I was really excited to find it. And they tell the story of the murder that happens in Girl on the Velvet Swing on an episode of My Favorite Murder. I'll try to find it and either link it below or have it pop up somewhere on the screen. But it is a crazy story about a woman in the 1920s who has this relationship with this man who is a little shady. He's much older than her. There's a bunch of rumors and speculation surrounding this story, and so I'm really excited to read the book about it. I've heard really good things about it. Just as a couple extra books, if I get time, I have Bad Blood checked out from the library. This book is about a startup company in Silicon Valley that was saying they could do this crazy blood testing, and they had the ability to see if people had diseases just from getting like a finger prick of their blood and then them mailing it in, and then it turned out to all be a big giant lie. And so the book is about that lie, how they got to that point, kind of who is in charge of stuff, and it's supposed to be a crazy story. And then another book that is just kind of an if I get time / if I end up being able to go to Barnes & Noble and buy it before the end of the month is Lost Girls by Robert Kolker. They just turned it into a Netflix movie a couple months ago. And I haven't watched the movie yet because I want to read the book first, especially in cases of true crime. I need to read the book first. And so if I get to it this month, that would be great. I believe it's about a mother whose daughter goes missing or is murdered, and she is not satisfied with the way that the cops are trying to find her daughter, and so she kind of goes into it herself, and it ends up becoming a serial killer. And so it's just about her and kind of her experience with that. That is the end of all the books that I'm going to be reading in May. If you like My Favorite Murder and have been interested in reading some of the books that they recommend, feel free to join me on My Favorite Murder on my Goodreads, which I'll link in the description. I have a list called My Favorite Murder Book, which is all the books that they recommend on the podcast, and then I also have a list called Last Book on the Left, which is all the books that they recommend on Last Podcast on the Left. So if you're interested in checking those out, feel free. I'll leave the link below. Give this video a like, subscribe to my channel, I guess, if that's a thing you want to do. That's all I have for you. Bye.